Part 2. Addiction Theory over the past 100 years. This chapter examines the emotional and social perspectives of our society during the past 100 years. It is this author's belief that only by examining these perspectives can we truly understand the current problems caused by addiction, as well as the emotional struggles of the addicted and by extension their loved ones. It will also give you a more thorough understanding of why you currently view addiction the way you do. We will do this by examining how each of the models adopted by both governments and societies over the past 100 years have affected both the substance user and their loved ones. We will also examine how some of these measures have actually been counterproductive, resulting in today's misunderstanding of addiction and the wasting of valuable resources. While some of these models gained the majority of societal attention during their time and became mainstream approaches for a specific period, these models also occasionally overlapped. During this process, you may also notice that sometimes different segments of society, governmental and religious, focused attention to the most provocative and culturally popular aspects of the problem in order to suit their own individual ambitions and goals, usually at the expense of the addict and their family. The sinner. There are two major perspectives which viewed substance use as a moral issue, labeling the user with names like degenerate, weak-willed, lush, bum, drunkard, and even sinner. These models' names were self-explanatory and fairly descriptive, and were often referred to as part of the dry moral model and wet moral model of addiction. Many followers of this model believed that drinking was a weakness to evil forces and even an act against God. Alcohol was perceived of as a tool for the devil's bidding. The wet moral model relegated the sinfulness of drinking to those who drank too much or too often, like the sin of gluttony. Those who overindulge face the wrath of their own sins. Under this model, it was not believed that alcohol itself was inherently evil, only the overuse or overindulging. Both models believed that the user had and maintained a conscious choice in the matter of drink. As mentioned above, the wet moral model relegated the sin of drink to those who drank too much, drank at the wrong time, or who failed to stop before intoxication was reached. Both models believed that the user had a choice in the matter of drink, and that those who became intoxicated were committing sin. Just like the adulterer or the thief, they acted and thereby chose to sin. Their suffering was of their own making. It was believed that the abuser would eventually stop after being motivated by the pains brought on by their own misdeeds. Under these models, there was no understanding of the phenomenon known as compulsion. Remember that during this era in our society, there were no such things as kleptomaniacs, shopaholics, sex addicts, no obsessive-compulsive disorders, or compulsive gamblers. There were no excuses or explanations for bad behavior beyond the individual. Individuals were held personally responsible for their shortcomings, and society was not yet to blame. Alcoholics and addicts were rarely treated or aided in their struggles, as it was believed that by helping them, the behavior would be condoned. Zero tolerance was the guiding force, which eventually led to a constitutional amendment and prohibition. So strong were these beliefs that it changed our Constitution. The dry moral model. If we take a closer look at the dry moral model, what it is suggesting is that alcohol use, and or by extension alcoholism, was the result of poor personal, family, or societal value systems. The alcoholic's parents, their church, and their communities were believed to have failed in their duty to impart true or real values to the community and the individual. This theory epitomized the "it takes a village to raise a child" principle. This era was unknowingly a very crucial period where the solution for the addiction problem may have serendipitously presented itself. Instead, it was skewed by oversimplification of the problem and the religious fervor of the time. Common knowledge does suggest today that environmental conditions play a role in how people make choices. Remember that at this time, the genetic links to addiction were not yet imagined. The village did indeed have an effect on the addict, but unfortunately, the reaction of the village and community was in hindsight counterproductive to the solution. Despite their good intentions, the creators of the dry moral model's belief system and the holders of those beliefs are in large part responsible for the overwhelming sense of shame many families of addiction, a disease, still experience today. Like the lepers of their day, these families were shunned, while children were told not to relate with family members from those types of homes. The shaming and ostracizing only worsened the struggles of children from already troubled homes, as they were now essentially cut off from the positive functioning of healthier neighboring family systems. This paradox cultivated a climate that actually made the unfortunate children of alcoholic homes suffer more needlessly, as now they themselves were also an unwanted segment of society. These children were innocent victims of a growing plague of addiction. It is quite possible that this type of ostracism led to more substance abuse by creating an outcast adolescent poised to rebel against a society that shunned them and their family, thus creating more distance and only segmenting the society away from a unified community. The effect it had was to push these people further from the church that shamed them and away from a possible solution often found by recovering addicts today in the form of a higher power. The dry moral model also imparted an unfair and often inaccurate sense of responsibility on the family of the addict. While we now believe that family dysfunction can lead to high risk-taking and using behaviors, which can eventually lead to addiction, the result cannot be exclusively correlated in scientific terms to the family's level of dysfunction. This erroneous correlation is simply eliminated by the mere fact or proof that not every abused child or child of a severely dysfunctional family becomes an addict or addicted. There is no provable direct cause and effect. In this model, the family was blamed. It was believed that the sinner should have been taught better, or have had modeled for them better values by his or her own family. It was believed by the proponents of this model that had these values been taught, the user would have never indulged or overindulged in the first place. While practitioners of the Muslim faith may also agree that the use of alcohol is a sin against God, this model predominantly evolved from the belief system of Southern Christians at the time. Many of these practices and motivations for abstinence are still alive in the U.S. and around the world today. The core belief here was or is that the devil often tempted people to commit sin, and that addiction was the wrath of having given in to that temptation as retribution for having sinned. It was believed that continued use allowed evil to grow stronger, and that it eventually caused distress for the entire family. Very representative of the adage, the sins of the father are cast out unto the son. You should also consider that it was believed during the evolution of this model that alcohol affected everyone the same, and that people with good morals and good values chose to not drink because of their love for God, and by extension the love of their family and community. It should be made very clear here that this author is not expressing an opinion about religious beliefs relating to alcohol consumption, and that while the beliefs discussed may seem extreme, people in societies who subscribe to these beliefs reportedly suffer less of the per capita ills of addiction by simply avoiding all use. They do, however, still get run over and killed by drunk drivers. As has been previously suggested, these perspectives led to much of the momentum necessary to amend the U.S. Constitution and establish prohibition. Prohibition officially made what is now recognized as a disease an illegal act. Those who suffered from the disease were considered criminals and not viewed as the ill people we believe them to be today. Stop for a second and think about the amount of momentum needed to change the Constitution, and you will still only be considering a small fraction of society's fervor to rid itself of the scourges of alcoholism in the 1920s. This was a religious fervor against a disease that tortures and kills more Americans per year than any war at any time in our history. A comparable amount of social momentum had not been seen or felt again in the United States until the attacks of 9/11. As mentioned, prohibition officially made a disease of addiction illegal to have. Think for a second. Can you imagine the United States outlawing a disease? Remember, an addict is an individual with a psychological, genetic, metabolic, emotional disease who at the time was being judged because of a disease and called a sinner. The fallout of these beliefs in regards to negative stigmatism means that to this day, you're still better off having a sexually transmitted disease than an addiction. During this era, it was believed that a religious conversion was the only way to get the user to change. The user had to come to believe that a relationship with God was more important than the brief relief of use. That by trusting in and waiting for God's grace, the user would come to feel a sense of wellness beyond that of the next drink or hit. Remember, change is about behavior. Healing is about a disease. The belief that addiction was a chosen misbehavior set the foundation for the criminality of addiction that still exists today. Unfortunately, for the non-believer, no focus was given to the value of abstinence as a healing tool. A major difficulty with this perspective is that the intense level of shame experienced by the user often prevented them from presenting for religious conversion, the cure, in the first place. Those persons too filled with shame just use more alcohol to overcome these feelings, these negative emotions, and their negative self-concept. Today, many addicts still fail to seek treatment or ask for help due to this overwhelming sense of shame and remorse. As in other models, the user often fled their homes, jobs, and communities after their repeated attempts to hide their illness failed. This flight is believed to have created and fueled a large hobo community of directionless train jumpers and anonymous street bums of the 20s and 30s. Addicts were forced to flee their home to prevent bringing shame on their families. In order to save face in the community, families often created lies to explain where the family member had gone, often using stories of faraway jobs, military service, or even death. Insights from this model. The belief that use of alcohol was a sin and not a disease. That alcohol affected everyone the same, but that some people were more sinful. No one should drink, and then the problem would not exist. Like the views of nudity at the time, the mere presence of alcohol tempted man beyond his personal strength. The only real hope for change was through religious conversion. No real medical care or professional clinical treatment was available. Failure in this model resulted in major shame and diminished self-respect, leading to more use. The alcoholic often gave in to the disease after religious conversion failed. The alcoholic often fled their only support system, which could have been helpful to sustaining their recovery and abstinence efforts. Morals with a shot of rationalization. While the dry moral model may have been a little hard for the addict to swallow, there was hope yet to come. This hope presented itself in what appeared at the time to be a new and revolutionary approach, often referenced to in hindsight as the wet moral model. This model would revitalize the morality of drinking by allowing for the use of alcohol in moderation. This was very exciting and optimistic news for a prohibition-ravaged society, as well as to the struggling alcoholic who could not fathom life without alcohol. It is quite possible that this model evolved after the shock of prohibition settled in with Northern Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, who did not see drinking as a sin of weakness, but instead frequently incorporated wine and spirits into religious services and positive celebratory occasions. The hope for the alcoholic sprung from the suggestion that the use of alcohol could not only be continued, but that the drunkard would actually be instructed on how to use successfully. This breakthrough was considered to be revolutionary at the time because the wet moral model's simple aim was to teach the problem drinker how to consume alcohol appropriately. The addict would be taught the rules for drinking, and this would somehow end their troubles with alcohol. How about you? Ever subscribe to this notion? Where do you think it evolved from? Now you know. While still morally centered, it was in this model that society would take its first non-religious measures to address the problem, as prohibition was indeed the result of religious fervor and pressure against consumption. In this model, society sought an educational solution to the problem. There are some historical accountings that suggest agencies like the National Institute of Health sprung from these efforts, as Congress was lobbied to take action on a health problem of alcoholism in the shadow of Prohibition's repeal. Both members of society and the government as a whole would now begin to teach the alcoholic how to drink or use properly. These supposed rules included what age, how many, how often, what time, what type or kind of alcohol to drink. This model suggested and believed that willpower was indeed the cure for willful misconduct. It was believed at the time that man had complete control over his physiology in regards to alcohol. Alcoholism was not yet recognized as a physical or health problem, but instead as a shortcoming of character, of failed insight, and of poor decision-making skills. Ideals related to obsession and compulsion were not widely understood. As odd as it may seem to us now, some remnants of this philosophy still exist in many motor vehicle administrations around the country today, where offenders are ordered to attend DWI classes and even the resolutely titled social drinker programs. Such titles only act to confuse the issue of addiction and to foster the often preferred perspective that the drinker has only a current problem and not a chronic, progressive, emotional and physical disease. One of the greatest shortcomings of this model is that it evolved from mainstream society's desire to explain the ills of drinking rather than to treat them as a medical condition that it was then and still obviously is now. The model did not take into account the dangers of withdrawal, physical addiction, or as mentioned above, compulsion. Because of the shortcomings in this model, many people would die common alcoholic deaths from accidents, alcohol poisoning, and complications of alcohol withdrawal. Many future death certificates would report heart attacks or heart stoppage as the primary cause of demise. A heart attack is often or can be an event of alcohol withdrawal. As the central nervous system depressant alcohol is removed, the heart rate increases substantially, often leading to cardiac events. As might be expected, unacceptable levels of use often continued as the alcoholics sought to treat their withdrawal symptoms. Unacceptable levels of use would be hidden or outright denied as it threatened societal perspectives on alcohol as well as this model. It threatened its very core philosophies. Few citizens, or for that matter, even those in the medical community, would dare to confront the issue of illness in a post-prohibition era, which often feared a return to the illegalization of alcohol. One man who feared such scrutiny in a confused society wrote the chapter, The Doctor's Opinion, in the beginning of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Originally, Dr. Silkworth asked that his name not be included in the first edition for just this reason. It could be argued that this model identified for us as a society, and from a behavioral standpoint, how denial of the problem might prohibit confronting unacceptable behavior. The belief at this time was, if you lost control, you had a problem, and you were considered weak. Because of this, everyone, including the user's family, rationalized and justified the negative consequences of excessive use, eventually believing their own lies. Dysfunctional skills like rationalization, externalization, and blaming took flight. This model quite possibly retarded or postponed treatment advances and resulted in painful cycles of failure, remorse, suicide, broken hearts, abused children, and devastated families. By today's standard, it is widely accepted that once a person loses control over their substance use, they must abstain completely. In the wet moral model, the user just continued to beat their head against a proverbial wall of countless failures to regain control of their lives as they tried to learn how to drink successfully. I ask you to take a minute and try to think of any other disease where willpower is recommended as a form of treatment. Imagine if your doctor told you to use your willpower to control your blood sugar, or to treat your diabetes, to stop letting your blood pressure rise so high, and even more preposterous, to not smoke as much or to slow down your smoking to treat your lung cancer. While this comparison may seem ridiculous and extreme, I remind you once again that alcoholism is a chronic disease in the same class as the aforementioned conditions. At a minimum, we should consider that a mental health issue like bipolar or manic depression is a disease of the mind, but yet we still do not have the expectation that the sufferer can control his or her condition strictly by will. Our own struggle to group these problems together is evidence of our own still-held misconceptions about alcoholism and addiction. In this model, we've learned alcoholics are simply not following the rules of drinking. We learned that responsible drinking methods can be learned and even legislated, the drinking age. Society can rally to aid the alcoholic in non-religious ways. There were no agencies in place to provide this health education. Willpower is all that is needed and believed to be a viable tool in fighting addiction. That this solution was a one-pronged approach with a one-model-fits-all solution. Thousands suffered and died needlessly as the problem is ignored, hidden, and even denied. The wants, goals, and denial of many ignores the plight of the few. This model ignores physical withdrawal and physiological addiction and compulsion. Since it suggests the person can keep using, many users do so and experience loss of control, dysfunction, and death without public assistance.